Hi, I'm happy so many of you showed up here. I'm here just to briefly introduce a man that really doesn't need an introduction because he's already been introduced once today. Martin Anward will be coming up here and talking about Stellaris and after the apocalypse and the future of the franchise. He has actually requested that he have a longer session for questions. So usually people talk for a long time, then there's a short time for questions. Martin has deliberately asked for a lot of questions. So try to scrounge up as many good questions as you can so you can have a wonderful Q&A session. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce a man that describes himself as a game director of Stellaris and a body pillow enthusiast. Martin Anward.
All right. Hello, everyone. I feel like I was just here. So, I am here to talk about After the Apocalypse, which is essentially a lot of things we'll be doing in the future with Stellaris. Stellaris came out just about 2 years ago, and okay, there we go. So, when we released Stellaris, after the first couple of updates, we actually sat down and made a roadmap going basically several years into the future. Now, it wasn't a specific roadmap like, oh, we're going to make this expansion on this date and on this year and so on, but rather we sat down and thought, okay, we have this game. We released it, there's more we want to do with it, so what precisely are we going to do with it? We obviously took in a lot of feedback, we had our own ideas, we had our giant list of things that we wanted to do before release, but didn't have time for, which is, I'm sure no game developer has ever experienced that before. No. And what we basically came out, what we wanted to do is that we wanted obviously to focus on the mid-game. Because when Stellaris came out, we felt that we had a very strong early game. We had a fairly strong end game. You know, we had the exploration and we had the end game crisis. But in the middle, it was sort of a lull. Things kind of stopped happening, and players felt that you were kind of waiting for the big end game event. So we also decided that as for the expansions, we wanted to have each expansion have a very specific focus. We didn't want to do sort of mixed expansions because we wanted to be able to take the time to also make some really big free updates alongside the expansions and have the mechanics of the free updates work together well with the actual expansion mechanics. So we basically decided back then that we wanted to do a politics expansion, which we did with Utopia. We wanted to do a war expansion, which we did with Apocalypse. We wanted to do a diplomacy expansion, which we haven't done yet. And we wanted to do an economy expansion, which, again, we haven't done yet. As to which one is next, Exploration. Well, yeah, that's the story pack. So we also decided that while we were doing these major expansions, we also wanted to make sure that we could add more exploration and story content to the game, because one thing that we really discovered that players like is the stories, the writing in Stellaris, the things you encounter, the lore of the game that we sort of built up almost by accident as we worked on it. So we came up with the concept of the story pack, starting with the Leviathan story pack, and now, of course, most recently, Distant Stars, which some of you might have got the chance to play for like 5 minutes. Was it good? Excellent. This clicker is not kind of tricky, so forgive me. Anyway, alongside this, we've also done a bunch of dev diaries where we have sort of talked about this roadmap. I know we did one after Leviathans, we did one after Utopia, we did one after Apocalypse, and each time we've sort of updated, we've crossed off goals we've already finished, and we talked about new goals we have added for the future. So I just sort of wanted to briefly go through these goals and actually give you a little more detail. Not in terms of when you can expect it or precisely what you can expect, but essentially what we're thinking, what we want to do with the game from a high-level concept perspective. And later you can ask some questions and I may or may not answer. So, one thing that we definitely have been looking at and actually been a bit of a hot topic on our forums and such lately is the planets, and specifically the tile system. And I'm going to just come out here and say that I am not at all happy with the tile system. It's the sort of system that works. It's got some good gameplay mechanics. It works really well in the absolute start of the game when you have a few planets to manage. But of course, it gets out of control when you have a lot of planets to manage, which is naturally why we introduce sectors, for instance, because you really can't. Well, you can, and I know some people do, but it's not that fun to go through 100 planets and click upgrade on 20 different tiles on each. Another problem with the tile system is also that it very artificially limits what planets can be. A planet is just a collection of tiles. Each tile can have one pop, each tile can have one building. To me, this leaves planets feeling a little bit like a very big resource extraction operation rather than a place where people actually live, a place where there's culture, where there's cities, where your future space society is happening, or your devouring swarm is devouring, whichever you prefer. So one thing we want to do in the future is actually to kind of go back and give planets a major overhaul, possibly even scrap the tile system altogether. And I can tell that one was popular. And make sure that you have the ability for more diverse planets. And there might be something coming a little further down the presentation if the clicker decides to work. So, also, we want to add in trade. Specifically, you have the trade agreements between empires, but you don't really have anything kind of simulating the private economy, trade between empires, goods flowing back and forth. Now, we don't want something incredibly complex, but that doesn't quite fit the scope of the game. In other words, we're not going to have Victoria in Stellaris. Sorry. I know. But we do want the ability to actually sort of specialize your empire in trade, to have these trade agreements between more friendly empires, to have one of the strengths of federations be a sort of shared economy. But this also should obviously be vulnerable. It should be able to be raided, it should be able to be disrupted. And if you're having a disruptive war and one of your primary trade lanes is cut because you didn't protect it enough, well, that probably wasn't very good. A galactic community is also something we talked about in the past, where we want to add more of a sense that the sort of galaxy is progressing when the empires start meeting each other. Right now, you have this sort of phase of the game where communications are sped up immensely and everyone just starts meeting everyone, but it's all just a bunch of very bilateral communications like, hello, Blorg, we are the Avians. Hello, Avians, we are the Blorg. And rather than that, I would like a more dynamically evolving concept of a galactic community, which you can sort of opt into or opt out of. The devouring swarm probably isn't going to sit down at the Space UN and agree on which strategic resources are permitted, but the xenophiles can have their little club over there and ban crabs or whatever it is they want to do. Deeper federation mechanics would also be a priority for the future, where we want a sort of politics layer to federations. I've been thinking about having the actual federation president and the federation planet be a sort of independent capital that manages the fleet and more of a political system where you can barter for influence in the federation, do favors for others, and in exchange be able to put your leaders in place and eventually possibly subsume the entire federation and win a sort of diplomatic victory. Also, we would like star systems to feel more alive. One thing we talked about a lot before release, and we were always intending to do, is to have more movement in the systems, little ships moving around, a sense that your capital system, where everything is happening, should feel much more different from a remote mining system. It should look different. You should be able to see there's a colony here, there's people moving and living. And it's definitely something that we could also tie into trade. The stronger your trade routes, the more little freighters are moving around your space, which is also makes it very obvious where the vulnerable arteries of your empire are. And of course, espionage, everyone's favorite. So the problem a bit with espionage in a lot of games is that espionage is kind of added as a way to check a box. you're going to make a space 4X. Okay, you can have spaceships, you can have a ship designer, you can have space combat, probably, you can have some planets, you can have some colonists, you're going to maybe have some space monsters, and you're going to have espionage. Okay, you're just going to have espionage. And then you have espionage, and it's very rarely particularly good. So when we talked about espionage in the past, I've pretty much always said that espionage will come when we feel that we have the mechanics to support it. And I definitely think that we are starting to approach that point, that we could have a more in-depth intel system where there is a level to how much you know about an empire, depending on are their borders open, how do you have communications, do you have a trade agreement? If you have a migration agreement, you probably know everything because, of course, your spies are coming alongside all the people moving around. But if they're xenophobic isolationists, the borders are closed, then nobody is really going to know their ship designs, rather than having this system where if you happen to have a science ship in range with some sensors. And possibly some sort of sabotage, which would possibly tie into factions, could tie into planets, etc. Yes, there will be opportunity to comment and question later. So, I am just going to show this. And I am going to mention that in Stellaris, one thing we do a lot of the time is that we prototype features. For instance, we actually started developing the early prototypes for the Cherry and Apocalypse features in about a year before it came out in early 2017. So even as we're working on whatever the next thing is, we're testing features. We're building, we're prototyping. Sometimes they come into the game, sometimes they don't come into the game. But everything has sort of a long tail because we are able to do that because we have a roadmap. This is something we are currently prototyping. I'm going to show you this screenshot. I'm very shortly going to take it away, and I'm not going to answer any questions about it. And now it's gone. Okay, that's it for the talk. But I will now be taking questions for, about half an hour or so. So if you have questions about Stellaris, about the future, about just about anything, about body pills.
That was quite quicker than I expected, so I had to run and get this, because we have this really cool mic/ball thing. So I'm going to throw this to you, and then you can speak into it. Speak into it like that, and we will all hear the question. Make sense? All right. Let's hope I don't injure anyone. Who was first, Martin? Where do you want this?
Let's have it to the suit.
Yeah, why not, right?
The well-dressed gentleman or lady, or however you identify.
I knew this was a bad idea.
Got to work on that throwing arm, Daniel.
Yeah.
Okay.
It's because you're wearing a suit. That's the reason.
Probably have to open them out.
It's because you're wearing a Lynx suit. Let me see if I can solve this. All right, Paula's coming with a mic.
This is a very new technical issue. I don't think we had this one particular issue before. So forgive us for being unprepared.
We didn't expect the Lynx, right?
Sorry. Okay. Well, let's move on with another question while you guys try to solve that.
So can we get can you, Mr. Lynxman, can you please throw the ball back to us? Oh, there we go. Great, thank you. That's for you.
About espionage, an idea, cloaking devices for ships.
So the question is about cloaking devices for ships. Cloaking devices and stealth in general would most certainly be part of any sort of espionage system. I mean, it's a sci-fi staple, and it's one of the sci-fi staples that we don't have, and we probably should, but it's also one of those things that has a lot of potential problematic implications and should definitely be done together with any sort of espionage system where we can plug it in. Okay.
So can you throw it over there? Yeah, watch out, guys. Oh, shit. Oh. And then you have to hold it, you have to speak into the black thing and hold it really close to your face.
Test.
Okay, Martin, has the vision of
Okay.
Stellaris changed since the first dev diary?
Sorry, I cannot
All right.
hear. I'm not sure that thing is working.
Let's do this the traditional
Let's
way
do the
instead. Yeah.
regular microphone
go.
instead.
Has the vision of the game changed since the first dev diary? Is it still mainly exploration focused, or something has changed in the process of development?
So you're asking about the overall focus of the game.
Yeah.
So Stellaris has always been a lot about exploration, but it's also always been a, as we call it, 4X grand strategy hybrid. What I think has changed a little bit since release is that on release, we mostly had a lot of emphasis on the 4X, because ironically, even though grand strategy is kind of our bread and butter, the fact that 4X was what was new to us meant that during the actual development of the game, 4X is what we had to focus on. We had to iterate on, rework, redesign to try and get right. And it meant that sort of in the end, we didn't necessarily have time for all of the grand strategy elements that we wanted to do. So post-release, I would say that it's not so much the focus of the game has shifted, as that we have begun building up the grand strategy side of the game more to be in balance with the 4X side.
Okay, so let's do one at the front right here. Hang on.
Hi. Currently, you can research, say, all weapon types.
Yes.
What's your opinion on mutually exclusive technologies?
I definitely think it's an interesting idea. I mean, we have a little bit of that, although it's not quite technologies, with the ascension paths. And I think more of that would actually be really good. For instance, you could have some sort of biological ships, or like all the old Space Empires game, time-based technology, although that's a bit of a potential issue. But it's a cool sci-fi thing, and I don't know if you noticed, but we tend to put a lot of cool sci-fi things in Stellaris. No. So yes, I do like that idea, and it's probably something we would continue doing with sort of ascension perks and these sort of mutually exclusive options for empires.
So the question that is probably on everyone's mind right now, are space unicorns coming to us in 2.2?
Okay. So here's the thing with the space unicorns. Back when I promised them, I said they would be here within 4 major updates. Now, I know some people have counted the 1.9 update along with the humanoid as a major update, but that's sort of not how we count it. So what this means is that the update Niven, along with Distant Stars, that's coming out on Tuesday, will be the 3rd, which means that at that point, whichever the next major update is the deadline for unicorns.
I'll let him go first. He wanted. Thanks.
Listen, I have only had immense success with drunkenly promising things on Twitter.
Will there ever be advanced silicon-based life forms, like spacefaring silicon life forms, or any race that you can choose that is silicon-based?
So this is definitely something we're talking about as a possible, for instance, future sort of species/story hybrid pack, where you could actually play a silicoid race. I think that I don't want to add silicoids as just portraits, because it would feel strange to play a silicoid, but the silicoids still go till the soil and eat corn. So it would definitely have to be some kind of mechanics. For instance, you know, they eat minerals instead of food. They reproduce in a different way. Similar, I would say, that if we were to add playable parasites. I also think that that's also just something where we shouldn't just throw in a bunch of portraits and call it a day, but actually have, you know, the ability to play to go old. Not literally, don't sue me. And, you know, actually be these parasites that can be attached to any portrait. Kind of a little like driven as simulators. So it's I'm not going to promise anything, but it's something we're definitely talking and thinking about, and something I would like to do.
Hello. I don't want to be the buzzkill here, but one question I think everyone has on its mind basically is, what are you currently doing about improving endgame performance? Because as all we know, as soon as you approach the endgame, the game, well, runs quite slow.
Okay, so the question is about improved endgame performance. And performance is the sort of thing that we're kind of always working on with every update and every release. there's never, one problem with performance, and it's actually very different from hardware to hardware. For instance, after release 2.0, there was a bunch of people who said the endgame performance is amazing now, and it used to be terrible. And then there were people saying the endgame performance is terrible now, and it used to be amazing. We actually have statistics, and it's shown that performance has improved since 2.0. Performance has improved pretty much in every major update. But of course, it's an ongoing process. Something that we are looking into that will be a major performance booster is actually to rewrite the economic back end of the game, because it's written in such a way that it's a lot of the CPU cycles in the game. So all I can say is we'll not stop working on it, and hopefully you will at some point have a better experience in the endgame.
Yeah, I just have a question mainly about the war diplomacy at the moment, because right now it's either surrendering status quo or enforcing your demands. But there are some factions, mainly the purifiers, who can't really enforce their demands because they are automatically at a minus 10,000 penalty. So is there going to be more options into the actual diplomacy for war later on?
So in terms of whether there's going to be more options for diplomacy in war later on, in terms of the actual peace settlements, I don't think so. The main reason purifiers can't enforce their demands is obviously that the purifiers want everything and they want to kill everyone, so it doesn't necessarily make sense. You can surrender to the purifiers if you're absolutely feeling suicidal, but it's not generally something I feel that any species would do, because they know they're going to die if they do it, and they only 99% shows know that they will die if they don't surrender, so it's sort of why would they? I would say that where we could expand diplomacy during war is more in terms of options like the ability to intervene, the ability to possibly negotiate separate peace, although that's kind of a can of worms I'm not necessarily sure we want to open. But to have the big problem with sort of separate peace, intervention, all that, is that wars can become unpredictable, where the player starts a war with a small empire and suddenly half the galaxy is against them. And every time that has sort of happened in one of our games, like Alliance Chains in EU3 and EU4, it's probably been not popular, to put it like that. So that would be the area where we could expand, but it's also an area where we kind of have to be careful that we don't take away the player's ability to strategically plan their wars.
In my last game, yesterday at the LAN, I got psionic materialists because of an anomaly. Are you planning on adding more like crossover ascendancies or ascendancy at all with like the next patches or next DLC add-ons?
So there's no immediate short-term plans for expanding on or adding more ascendancies, because the short-term plans is basically distant stars, and we have announced everything in that. In terms of looking into it in the future, I personally feel it makes more sense to focus on more diverse ascension paths rather than sort of trying to mix them together. The problem mixing them together is that you have this very distinct choice. Okay, do I want to be psionic? Do I want to be a robot? Do I want to be the Zerg? Not quite, but do I want to make delicious livestock? And when you sort of, okay, I can be biological, but also a bit psionic and also a bit robot, it sort of stops being these distinct choices for your empire, and it sort of more becomes this muddled and confused mess. So I wouldn't say it's out of the question. I mean, psionic cyborgs is kind of cool, but it's probably not something we're going to be focusing on. Rather, we will focus on adding more choices for ascension paths.
Hi. I just wanted to return to the topic of war, and I wanted to ask, since personally I feel like even though in the past few updates ground combat has been improved greatly, I still feel that sometimes invasions can just basically go down to just sheer numbers and having like giants on one of your planets. And are there any like plans to enhance the land combat system?
So I don't think we'll necessarily be revisiting the ground combat system anytime soon, because we already worked a lot on it for the war update, and that would kind of be part of the war update. At least not talking major reworks or major changes or anything like that. I would somewhat disagree that it comes down to just numbers. I've personally found that something that before 2.0 was basically pointless, like having very strong battle thralls where Gene Warriors now is super meaningful because you can take even very heavily fortified planets without bombing and without losing troops and without getting war exhaustion. I would say that the biggest problem with ground combat still comes from the fact that there is still not that much diversity between the armies, and that it can still be a bit of a pain to manage the transports. So if there's areas we'll improve on, it would be more those. Also sort of the AI's ability to command transports, because they're not that good at that.
Coming back to the Ascension perks, I have sometimes the feeling that the psionic ascension is a little bit overpowered, because when the robots fire,
the contingency?
Yeah, the contingency. I'm immune against any kinds of sabotage or assassination if I'm the psionic, if I've got psionic, because, oh, yeah, you look like a block, but I feel you are not a block, so move on, citizen. There's the incinerator, please jump into it. The other Ascension passes don't give any special bonuses when the other endgame crisis fires. So is there any ideas to give them also a little bit bonuses, like the biological are better against the Scourge, or the AI, the robots are better against the Unbidden? Anything there planned?
There's no concrete plans, but it is something we're sort of thinking about. Something I also wanting to think about in terms of the crisis would be kind of desperation projects. Or not in the sense of, there have been suggestions like, oh, you should just be able to more or less solve the Praetorian Scourge by inventing a virus if you can't beat them. The problem with that sort of thing is that then the endgame crisis just boils down to, here's a special project, now it's done, okay, now they're dead. It's a lot harder to make that sort of engaging mechanics when it comes down to sort of events and special projects, because you don't have the strategy, you don't have the logistics, you don't have everything that sort of comes down with beating them in a war. With that said, something like if you are biological, you can find out a way to weaken them, to get a damage bonus against them, to become better against them, or possibly even, though it's unrelated to the question, that you could, if everything is going really badly, you could build an arc ship and send it to another galaxy. It wouldn't actually mean anything per se, but it would be a nice little, okay, at least someone made it kind of touch. So to answer the question, we do want to expand more on the endgame crisis, and it would be really neat to actually have the different ascension paths be differently useful against the different crises, but we'll have to see when that happens.
Well, you do have pirates, but is it any plans for legal pirates, like privateers or maybe smugglers or something?
So this would tie into the question is about pirates and privateers. This would tie into the trade system I talked about earlier, where we want to sort of have trade routes and such in the future. And I feel like whenever we do that, we would also have basically give pirates another pass and make them more about economic damage and actual raiding rather than going and blowing up a mining station. And I definitely think that raiding other people's trade lanes and having privateers would be a part of that.
Hi, up front. You were talking about fleshing out the galaxy, the whole idea of the galactic community and the lore. And have you considered at all looking at back at EU4? Hi.
I was looking for you.
It's okay. I appreciate it.
Thanks for the help.
Yeah. Have you considered looking back at EU4 at all for recording? Oh, that blacked out. What? Ooh. Realm history or previous rulers, or looking at ways of just recording the history that's going on in the game?
Okay, so the question is whether we're looking into any sort of recorded history in terms of at the end of the game you can see the history of rulers, of the empire, of planets. It's something we talked about. It's something we don't have any concrete plans for. If we do that, I would like to make it a bit better and more interesting than sort of the EU4, here's a bunch of text. But it would be really cool if at, for instance, the end of the campaign, you could go through a bunch of highlights, you know, your first colony, and you could even save like a snapshot of the first colony so you can sort of see it. Here's your ruler, he accomplished that, or she accomplished that, and here's the war, it didn't go so well, etc. So it's in the area of cool idea, we'll see if it ever happens. Also, it's not obvious from you guys, but the lights are kind of blinding, so it's kind of harder to see people on the edges.
Hi. Just, yeah, in front of you.
There you go.
A quick question. Can we imagine a scenario where you will be in an already developed galaxy and you're playing a race that is trying to take over an existing empire like the Sith in Star Wars?
Okay, so the question is imagining any scenario where you would start as a more developed, essentially, I think, a pre-fallen empire or more like an advanced empire?
Or a new race that just appeared and wants to take over the world?
Okay, so sort of galactic invaders. It's definitely a cool sort of idea. I would say the problem with it is that it's so far outside the context of the game, of the symmetric starts. So you would have to have a completely different kind of game mode created for it. I do think that it would be the sort of thing that's possibly better as its own game. I'm not going to say no entirely, because again, it's a cool idea, but I don't honestly know how to do it justice within the game that we have right now.
Cool, guys, we have 15 minutes left for Q&As. If we could form a queue over here, people who want to ask a question, we can stand in line and do it. Otherwise, it's going to be kind of hard for us to track. Sorry for the inconvenience. It's the first Q&A session. We're learning as we're going.
We'll be better next time.
As they say over at Sega, Rome 2 was not patched in a day. Am I right?
Hi, you were talking about diplomacy, and I was just wondering if you have anything more to say about that.
So, diplomacy, was the question if I have anything more interesting about that. Well, if it wasn't obvious, the part I talked about with like the galactic community, with deeper federations and that, would definitely be part of a sort of diplomacy update. I also think that any such update would generally involve going back and looking at diplomacy, seeing the parts we can improve, making a better trust system, possibly a favor system in some vein, like EU4, and just making your allies easier to understand and interact with. So I hope that sort of answers your question, but it's all in kind of theoretical, undefined future terms. But we definitely want to do a diplomacy expansion at some point, and of course we kind of want to make diplomacy better in the diplomacy expansion. I know that's surprising.
Hey, Martin.
Hey.
I had a question about factions and specifically the system behind it. Right now, it's very difficult to flip your empire's ethics if you're playing very wide because there's so many pops to deal with in order to flip them and whatnot. Are there currently any plans of fleshing out the faction system in such a way that there can be uprisings in your empire, political discontent, let's say McCarthyism style witch hunts for certain factions and whatnot, or maybe even a split off somewhere, basically more events around factions and fleshing out the character of your empire rather than everything around it.
So, are there any future plans to improve and flesh out factions? Short answer, yes. Yeah, there's a long answer. I'm just trolling you. No, the long answer is that there's a few different things I would like to do with factions. The first one is just a sort of basic improve the way their happiness works, turn it to sort of an approval stat and have the influence you get come scaling from that and have different thresholds of effects. Because right now they're a bit uneven in terms of what makes them happy, how easy it is to keep them happy, the ethics attraction, so just general a tightening up of the faction system. Possibly in the future, and probably as part of a diplomacy update, would be going back and making a more explicitly sort of political faction system that ties into diplomacy, that ties more into other empires, and also might tie into espionage. You know, you can go in and support certain factions in other empires. That's all very undefined, as in there's no design written for it, but we do want to do more with them, yes.
So, with all that talk about diplomacy, is there any plans for Galactic Council interventions, war against more war-mongering empires and xenophobes?
Okay, so the question if there will be more options for things like coalitions, for example? Possibly, yes. One problem with adding more things like that is that it's already kind of difficult for warmongering empires to expand, depending on where they end up, because you can end up to 5 Federation builders, and they're all best friends, and their ships just really like to shoot yours. So if we add more ability and a more active AI in intervening, we would also have to add more ways to strengthen the warmongers to sort of balance it up so that, we still have conquest, we still have growth, we still have things going on in the galaxy. But I do think you could probably expect to see something like that in a diplomacy-focused update. No promises.
You've mentioned it a few times in live streams and also today. Any changes to things like victory conditions? Because at the moment it's basically conquer the galaxy.
Yeah, so the victory conditions are kind of terrible. I've known that for a long time, and it's been the sort of thing where I don't really want to expand on existing victory conditions because they're kind of terrible. I have been thinking about a couple different things. I know I talked about in the past with making victory conditions more like individual empire goals, where you kind of set the goal for your empire, not necessarily right at the start of the game, but at some point down the line, I want to leave the galaxy, I want to conquer the galaxy, I want to ascend, I want to have everyone as livestock, whatever it is your goal. And when you accomplish that, you sort of win, but everyone else doesn't necessarily lose. So it's more of a capstone to your campaign. You can, of course, keep playing, but what you want to accomplish. Another more sort of short-term solution I've been thinking about is replacing the domination victories with some kind of scored victory. So you would still have the conquer everyone ending, but you would also have, at a certain point of the game, it's sort of everyone is scored alongside it, and whoever is at the top wins, basically. You get a placing. Again, of course, you could keep playing after that, because we could tie that into a lot more factors, like the strength of your economy, the strength of your diplomacy, how well you did against endgame crisis, every Praetorian you kill gives you a point, or something along those lines. And that means that we could actually let people win without necessarily going and killing everyone else or forming the biggest federation in the entire game.
In the new Niven patch with the clustered star systems and with the talk about a potential trade DLC in the future, have you given any consideration to galactic infrastructure? For example, highways or galactic roads for raiding. For example, in Star Wars, the Mandalorians crashed the road that supplied a lot of money for the Galactic Republic.
Yeah,
that was a big part of defeating them.
So basically, you're asking if there's thought about things like space highways and things like that. Possibly, yes. I mean, at the very least, like I said, we talked about trade, and we talked about trade routes. And you would definitely have that certain parts of your empire would be important routes where a lot of ships and goods and money is moving. And these would sort of become your galactic highways. Whether that would be associated with having to develop infrastructure, at the very least you would probably have to defend them. You might have to build star bases or have ships patrolling them. But actual dedicated sort of road infrastructure in space, I don't necessarily know if that makes sense. Besides, the gates and other megastructures that we have right now.
Hi, do you read much science fiction by way of kind of research when you're designing updates? So for instance, when you've got, when you're naming a patch after a writer, does the development team then go and read that writer?
Okay, so the question is if we read science fiction to research. Not explicitly sort of to research, but we definitely have a bunch of people in the team, me included, who read science fiction, and obviously we take a lot of inspiration from the science fiction we have read. Like, there is a reason we named the Cherry Update, because sort of the first feature that we talked about was big space stations controlling systems, and probably her most famous novel, at least space novel, is Down Below Station, which is about big space stations controlling systems. So we do try to theme our authors and, of course, draw inspiration, and I will typically be reading some sort of science fiction while working on the game, but explicitly in terms of, or like research, R&D, not really.
Hi, Martin. I was wondering if you consider to add further fallen empires for the ethoses that you have left out so far, so like pacifist or militarist fallen empires.
So short answer, yes. And this is definitely something I want to do, because Fallen Empire is one of my absolutely favorite things about Stellaris. When I first came into the project, one of the first things I sort of fought for and ended up implementing myself, mostly in the evenings, was the actual ethics and the whole system with the Fallen Empires, where they have these goals and these singular things that they want. So I definitely want, at the time, there wasn't time to add for all the ethics, but it's definitely something I want to do. And I have been thinking about what you could do with those different ethics. Like, for instance, you could take pacifist and make that sort of the xenophiles now, and then make the xenophiles much more obsessive stalker X kind of fallen empire. As you know, building observation posts about your world, spying on you, you discover one of your leaders is actually a blorg, that sort of thing. I think that would be fun.
Hello.
Hello.
It's talking about improving trade systems. For instance, I'm playing a feudal system where my vassals can expand on his own. But the problem is that every 13 years I have to go in to send them materials, credits, whatever. Have you ever thinking about improving how long the trade's gonna last, or even eventually go forever and then you cancel it yourself?
So specifically for subjects, something we've been looking at in the future, you're asking about essentially subsidizing your vassals and having more coherent trades. And I should also mention that probably a part of the issue you're having is actually a bug we discovered. People have been talking about AI is not developing planets, and we actually found the cause of that, and it should be fixed in distant stars. So hope I need some wood to knock on here. Anyway, but something we have been thinking about in terms of subjects is actually kind of sort of vassal contracts you could set up where you can sort of decide the rights and obligations, and when you ask someone to be your subject, you sort of send them, okay, yes, you're going to be my subject, you're going to provide me with fleet, you're going to send me minerals, but I will send you energy credits. You could change that sort of on the fly, and of course they will be happy if you change it in good ways, and they will be kind of angry if you change it in bad ways, but that would be a way to sort of directly subsidize your vassals without having to go back and occasionally pile minerals on them.
I actually have another question about vassals. One thing is, in the game currently, there's only really, it's one-to-one. You can't have vassals with vassals like in CK2, and for example in like the War in Heaven, if you play like a feudal society, you have a lot of vassals, but you join a side, you basically just give over all your vassals. Will there ever be a case where you could have like vassals or anything? Or
I'm going to give the incredibly helpful answer of maybe. The problem with vassals is that essentially it's kind of a bug fest. And it's been kind of a bug fest every time. I mean, CK has more explicit systems for it, but even CK has problems with things like civil wars where people get lost and legions switch and titles are inherited left and right. And in EU, you've also had the ability for sort of subjects, and that's caused a lot of issues. Actually, during the development of Stellaris, it was possible to have subjects of subjects, and again, it caused so many bugs, we basically took it out. So in order for us to do it, we would have to spend a very considerable amount of development time making sure that it actually worked properly, and I'm not sure that development time couldn't be better used in something else, although I do think it would be a good addition to the game.
Thank you.
We have about 4 minutes left, so we're going to go through your questions, guys, but after that, we don't have time for any more. Thank you.
Okay, my question is about the events and maybe adding like decisions or missions in the same way there's in EU4, if that's something you're looking at, or for spice up the mid-game, for example?
Yeah, so the question about decisions and missions. I don't necessarily know that missions will be something we would ever add, but we have definitely been looking into just adding a decision system to the game. I mean, even Hoy has one now, so I feel like we kind of have to, if only not to lag behind. So in short, missions, maybe, if we basically think of a good reason to have it and a good way to implement it, if we can think about, what would it add to the game, decisions, almost certainly.
Hi. I'm just wondering if there's some plans for anything like religion system or something, because I like to play fanatics, spiritualists a lot, and
I can tell by the robe.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, and I just feel that every time I play the game, I would like to make every other species see the light of our true. The one true God, and I would. Are there any plans for systems to?
There's definitely, I would say, plans. in the sense that it's something I would like to do. We would like to have more of a, it's not just, oh, everyone is spiritualist and therefore they get along because, of course, that's how it works on Earth. But, this is space where things are different. So maybe people of different religions, don't get along. That's weird, sorry. It's the question of, would it only be for spiritualists? Because then you will have a fairly big and chunky feature for one ethic, and then you kind of end up with this imbalance where you have this super interesting feature for one ethic, and then the materialists go, hey, where's our super interesting feature, and so on. So I would definitely say it's possible, something that might happen. We would have to figure out exactly how to do it in such a way that it doesn't just end up being, now spiritualist is the most fun ethic to play. Although it totally should be.
2 minutes left, so quick questions, quick answers, please.
I hope I'm not a part of a small demographic here, but one of the favorite features in Apocalypse was the fleet manager.
Yeah.
And I realized when it first came out, there was a lot of bugs with ships interacting on the fleet manager. And honestly, I still feel like fighting that between mid and late game. Is this something that's subject to change, or is this something that you want to push forward and hopefully fix for the better down the line?
So is the question whether we're intending to work and iterate more on the fleet manager? The answer is yes. Definitely yes.
Okay, cool.
Thanks, man.
Earlier, you've talked about the possibility of building Planet on the Federation level as a control center for it, which made me think of the Citadel from Mass Effect, which made me think of megastructures. Would there be any ideas for pulling together an entire Federation's constructional resources to build megastructures faster?
That is a really good idea. I actually hadn't thought of that one before. That's a good idea. I'm going to remember that one. Thank you.
Hello.
Greetings.
Recently, Hearts of Iron introduced mechanic of border conflict. Will there be a similar mechanic in Stellaris? Like, for example, small skirmishes for one tile between one Federation ship that crossed the border without war declaration and attack the outpost?
So the question is if we will look into some sort of border skirmish system, smaller conflicts.
Yeah.
This is actually something we talked about a lot while we were working on Cherry, and we were talking about the new war system, whether we could do sort of limited border wars, that's just about, you're fighting for a couple systems. And you can do that, but of course you still have to fight, sort of at least occupy them and wait, and whether we could do some sort of much smaller kind of war that's just about these two systems and wraps up pretty quickly. The problem with it is that how it tries into the truce system, whether you can use it as a way to avoid a big war. It ended up being something we didn't really have time for, but I would like to revisit. The problem, of course, is that we have kind of shifted away from war now. So no promises, but I do like the idea.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, last question.
Yes, last question. Hi, I'd like to know what your thoughts are about quality of life improvements. For example, automated trade deals that cancel when a condition is met. Like, I don't want you to automate the game for me. I'd still like to play, but something to make it easier to manage a large empire. Have you any thoughts on that?
Yeah, quality of life features is the sort of thing where everyone loves it. And we always try to put time for it, but it's always a question of what we can do when and with what resources. In our sort of internal database, I think we have about 700 improvements in a big backlog. That's mostly like a QA or a player or something going, hey, this is annoying, can we improve it? And we always try to do a bunch of those for every expansion, for every patch, whenever there's time. Sometimes I just come in and guerrilla code some quality of life things, like the little icons in the outliner. But so it's definitely something we will keep implementing, but it's the sort of thing that kind of has to be done as time allows. Okay, I think that was all the questions.
Thank you.
Of course, I will be around in the venue, so you can try and track me down, I guess, and ask questions in person if you didn't have the opportunity to do so here. Otherwise, yeah, I hope you enjoyed the talk.